Okay. Hannah, can you hear the stream? Or okay. Testing.
Oh, okay. Oh, weird.
Is it working?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll make sure
we're
the sound
good.
is working. Okay. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. This URL right here. Go ahead and go there. That's going to be the notes. If you're on the stream, it's actually in the description of the video. So you can go ahead and go there. You'll be able to access all the notes. So really quickly, what you're going to want to do, first of all, when you go to these notes, it'll say create your own web API. And you're going to want to install these three things right here, Node.js, MongoDB, and Postman. So just these are some different tools that we're going to be using all throughout the meeting, or all throughout the Codelab. So you're going to want to go ahead and install those. It might take a little bit to install, a little while. So go ahead and start installing those if you can. And then while we wait on them to install, we'll kind of talk about a few different things related to the meeting. Okay, so what is this meeting even all about, right? It's the title of it is Create Your Own Web API. So what is an API? Does anybody know? Can anybody give me an idea of what an API is? Okay, so
it's an application programming interface.
Correct. So yeah, it says it right there. But yeah, so it's application programming interface, and really an API just kind of abstractly is the way you're going to communicate with a piece of software. So you have a piece of software running here. You want another piece of software to be able to get information to and from that other piece of software. Then you're going to interact with its API, its application programming interface. So a web API specifically is just kind of the way you're going to communicate with some software that exists on the web. So I have a few popular examples here, and we'll actually look at these in a minute because I want to give some time for your stuff to install. So yeah, let's talk about like the kind of web development world for a minute. If you're going to be creating some kind of web application, like let's say, I don't know, you're going to create Facebook or something, really that's kind of split into two different categories. You're going to have the back end and the front end. So this Codelab is going to be all about the back end. Okay, so that's what this next kind of slide thing here. So what really even is the back end? Well, kind of thinking abstractly about it, the back end is going to be everything that the user doesn't see. So if any of you have taken like CS2, you talk about the model view controller architecture, the back end would kind of be like the model, right? And yeah, so the back end is just going to be everything that kind of the user doesn't see, everything that's happening behind the scenes, whereas the front end would be like the actual GUI part of everything. And if we're talking about web development, so in the web dev world, the back end usually is going to refer to everything that's on the server as opposed to the client. So that means like if you're like right here, I'm going to github.com. I'm in my browser, which is the client, and there's a server somewhere called github.com, and I'm communicating with it. But the back end all exists on that server that's somewhere that is kind of hosting all this. And all the software that's there is called the back end. So that's what a back end is. So why should you learn to create APIs? Well, if you want to be a web dev, then I mean it's pretty obvious why you should learn to create APIs. That's just how the web works, right? But if you don't, which I'm assuming there's probably people in here that don't want to be, then you still should learn how to create an API, or at least how APIs work, the basics of them, and how to interact with an API. So yeah, I mean, you're going to want to be able to interact with something. So say you're creating some kind of app, and let's say you want to create a weather app, for example. Well, without using an API, you would have to set up like a bunch of weather stations, which is pretty expensive, and like you'd have to know stuff about meteorology, and like you don't really want to have to do that just to create a weather app. Instead, you could use an API that you can access for free, or sometimes they cost money, but you can access the API for free, and they have all the weather stations set up. You can get that information and then make your app based on that. So it's useful to know how to use an API for that. It's also useful to know how to create an API. So let's say no matter what type of development you're doing, you have some kind of computation going on. Let's say you're doing like app development for like a phone. You may not want that computation being done on the phone. You may want it being done somewhere else on a server. And then, so what you're going to want to be able to do is put that computation on the server somewhere, and then you want to be able to access the results of that computation through the API. So that's why it's useful to learn how to, create an API. So at this point, has everyone been able to get everything installed? So nobody's having trouble with anything?
This is what I have. It's been sitting like this for a while.
Okay. Can you look?
Wonderful Postman. Wow.
So I guess real quick while we're waiting on that, are there any questions yet? Anybody? Anybody in the chat have questions? Okay. Okay. So just real quick while I wait, making sure everybody has everything installed. I can just kind of look at these. I'll look at this numbers API, which is a kind of, I think it's a pretty cool example of an API. So it has a front end built in right here that kind of allows you to access it. But I guess you could just do. I don't know. Can anybody give me a number? No. Okay. Let's do 8. And yeah, so it gives you just information about the number 8, like a random fact. So the number of principles of Yang in Chinese calligraphy is a random fact about the number 8. You can refresh it, it gives you a different. I thought it did. Yeah, it does. The number of furlongs in a mile. So what's happening here, right, is like we're sending a request here, and there's an API that exists on some server, and it's generating this fact, and then it's sending it back. And that's all using APIs, right? So that's what we're going to be building something, that is kind of like this, that uses an API. So I'm just going to think everybody's good now. So we're going to go ahead and proceed here. And we're going to actually start coding now. So
A quick point
Yeah.
on the Mongoose stuff. You're installing the community edition. Oh. That wasn't in the notes, but you want to find that. Yeah.
Okay. Right, and there were no questions in the chat or anything?
None yet.
Okay, cool. Okay, so this is part 1 now. So we've talked about what an API is. Now we want to actually create an API. The way you do that is normally using some kind of framework. And there's a lot of different frameworks that you can use, but they all essentially do the same thing. So for example, if you're used to like Python, you could probably use there's something called Django. You can use Ruby on Rails, is a really popular one. We've decided here to use one called Express, which is a framework for Node.js. If you're not familiar, Node.js is basically just, it's been described as server-side JavaScript. So you can imagine JavaScript exists in your browser. You just kind of take it out and put it on your computer where it exists outside of the browser, and that's Node.js. And then Express is a framework for it that allows you to create backend web services, APIs, right? Okay, so the first thing we need to do, make sure that you have Node.js installed. So the way you can do that is if you go to your command line and you run node-v, you should get a version number back. So like for example here, I don't know if you can see that very well. Yeah, I'll make it bigger. Oh, that doesn't. But
Yeah, I don't know. My mom's kind of playing like that.
yeah, I don't know. But anyway, here it says v8.9.0. That means that you do have Node installed. So you're gonna need that. Everyone have that? Good. Okay. Awesome. So that means that Node is installed, so we're gonna be able to do that. Now we need to be able to get the files for this specific Codelab. So if you're familiar with Git, you can clone this repository we're on right now, or you can just download the zip file. So I'll show you how to download the zip file if you're not familiar with Git. So I'm just gonna. What I did is just went to the homepage of this repo, and right here it says clone or download. I'm gonna hit download zip, and that's gonna go ahead and download that, and I'll just extract that into a folder somewhere. So just pick some kind of, pick some kind of folder that you're going to be working with. So I've chosen this one called Express Codelab, and I'm actually going to create another folder here. So I'm going to, what am I doing? I haven't used Windows in a long time. Extract.
Yeah, are you trying to get the files from?
Right. Did I hit the extract? Okay.
Just the easiest way to do this. Let's just re-download this real quick. Open it up.
Oh.
And now we have
Okay.
that, and you can just click and drag.
Oh, okay.
Or you can go in there, yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, cool. So just extract that zip folder into your workspace somewhere. And what you're going to want to do is actually go ahead and get, you don't need any of this stuff. It doesn't hurt to have it, I guess. So if you want to just work with this directory, that's fine. I'm going to actually take just this models directory, and I'm just going to copy that into another one. So it's, we're going to talk about this more in a minute, but what we're actually doing today, since Valentine's Day, we're going to create a API for a dating site. So I'm going to make a new folder called dating site and put that models directory inside it. So the dating site is now going to be our actual project folder. So we're going to go inside there and paste in that models directory that we copied and pasted from earlier. So that was part one. Everyone get up to this point? Good.
Really what we've done is we've just copied the models folder from this repository into some other clean directory.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to part two. Okay, so now what you're going to do is get inside we're going to actually initialize our npm package. So npm is the node package manager. If you came to our meeting about Electron, you kind of heard all about this, and a lot of this is literally just the same thing. But essentially with Node, we want everything to be a package, so we want everything to be a package so that we can install packages and stuff like that. So go ahead and open up your command prompt or your terminal or whatever, and go to that directory you made. So
It's stealing directory names from desktop.
yeah, okay. Okay, so go to that directory in your command line that you just made. Mine is, desktop Express Codelab dating site. And go ahead and run this command, this npm init command. What that's going to do is just going to initialize your project, your directory with as a node package. When you hit that button, it's going to ask you for several prompts. For the first, I think it's like 3, just hit enter. So package name, dating site, version is fine, description, just hit enter. Here, we're going to want to actually change something. So this is asking you for what entry point, like what's going to be the entry point of your app. So instead of, the default is index.js. When you're making what I've seen most people do when they're making APIs and stuff, they'll call it server.js. It's just kind of a convention. It makes more sense, I guess. So go ahead and type server.js there and hit enter. And then for the rest, just hit enter. Yeah. Okay, so what you'll see now is that so what this does is it initializes it as a Node.js package. So the two things that does, one, it's going to allow us to install packages through npm. So we're going to want to install some dependencies like Express and all the different libraries we're going to use. And then it also creates this package.json file, which is going to actually handle all the metadata, and it's going to keep track of all the dependencies. So all the packages you install, it's going to keep track of it in package.json. So we can look at package.json real quick. So I'm just here in Atom, and yeah, so here's package.json. And
this is in our working directory, our project directory. Yeah.
Yeah, so, and it's going to look something like this. It's going to have the name and all that stuff. You don't really need to worry too much about it, but just know that it exists. And now what we want to actually do is actually install some of our dependencies. We're going to install more later, but there's these two for right now. So just go ahead and copy and paste this command. Make sure you're in a working directory, copy and paste the command, and I guess you can't do that. Okay. npm install, that's just saying, okay, I'm going to use npm to install some things. --save means, okay, save these save the names of these into our package.json file. That way we can keep track of what packages we've installed. And then you put the names of all the packages. So the first one is Express. We already kind of talked about that. That's what we're going to actually, the framework we're actually going to use to create our API. The second one's Body Parser. We're going to talk more about that later. Just go ahead and install it right now. So hit enter. It might take a few minutes or seconds. Cool. So now if you look at package.json again, you should see it added this dependencies field, which now includes Body Parser and Express. So everyone get up to this point? Any questions? No? Okay, cool. All right, so now let's actually write some code. Right, so at this point, all we've done is like kind of initialize stuff. We're going to actually start writing our server now. So in that workspace directory that you created, create a new file called surfer.js. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Note that the reason we're calling it server.js is because that's when we did the npm init command, we said that the main file would be server.js. So in here, mine's called dating site, so whatever directory you had, just create a new file and call it server.js. Cool, and then go ahead and open that one up. Okay, so then inside server.js, go ahead and just copy and paste all this stuff. We'll talk about what it does here in a minute, but just copy and paste it into here and save it. Yeah, so like I said, in a minute we'll talk about what it does, but for right now, let's just go ahead and see like kind of what it does at this point. Right, so I'm going to actually run, so I'm inside the dating site directory on my terminal. I'm going to run node server.js. I'm going to hit enter. It should say listening on port 3000. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is go to my browser. Just going to open up a new tab, and I'm going to navigate to localhost 3000 and just hit enter. And you'll see we kind of are getting this error. So this is good and bad, right? Because A, it means we have created a server, like this is actually working. But it's saying cannot get, you can't really see that over here, but it's saying cannot get slash. What that means is that it's not actually processing the request properly. But the good news is, it is actually working. So if we, just to prove that to you, if we Control-C this, so we stop running the server, and we try to refresh, it's not going to be able to connect. We're going to get a different error, right? This site can't be reached. So that's, yeah, so that's just kind of making a basic kind of service. Yeah, so now let's actually look at that code and see what it's doing. Just kind of briefly run through it. This first line here, okay. So this first line here, I'm sure pretty much everyone here is familiar with Java or something. You probably imported things. This is basically a node. This is how you import things. We installed the Express library earlier, and we're going to import it by saying const express equals require express. That's all that is doing, is importing that package. This let app equals express, that's just what we're going to use to be able to interact with Express and tell it to listen for requests and all kinds of other stuff. Here, let is just a way to define variables in JavaScript. So I'm just defining a variable called port and call it 3000. So we're going to be listening on port 3000, and we're going to say app.listen on that number of the port. So it's going to be listening for a request at port 3000. It's basically all these two lines are doing. And then I just have a console.log there. That's just kind of just courtesy. So when you're running it on the command line, you'll know when it starts working. Okay, so now, but let's actually get it to listen for something and to actually do something when we navigate to there. So I'm going to add this little bit of code, this app.get / so this little bit of code right here. I'm going to go ahead and put it in between here. So I'm going to put it in between there. And we'll talk about that in a minute, what it actually does. But let's go ahead and run it now. So I'm going to run node server.js again. And go ahead and go back to Chrome. And if we go to localhost 3000 again, we can go ahead and refresh. And you'll see, actually you can't see. So you can see it says hello right there. That's because we told it to. So earlier it was saying it was getting like kind of an error message, and now it's actually sending something back. So that's good. Now to kind of look at what this code is doing, it's not really that complicated. If you've had like CS2, you talked about like HTTP, and you may know about it from outside of school too. But HTTP has different types of requests. We're going to talk more about them later. But this is saying like, okay, so app is kind of referring to our server, right? We're saying, okay, listen for a GET request at this location. So if you're not really familiar with, I mean, I'm sure everyone's accessed a website before, right? So you kind of like, you put like google.com/images or something. So if you just put google.com, there's kind of an implied slash there. So this is just saying like, if you just go to the root, listen for a GET request just at that location, at that root location. So what's going to happen is there's two arguments here. The first is the location, so listen for a GET request to this location. And then we have this, if you're familiar with JavaScript, this is a callback function. So basically everything inside this function is going to be called when our server receives a GET request at this location. I know that's kind of a lot to take in right now, but like, does that make sense for the most part? Okay, so and then but basically the big idea is, right, whenever we receive a GET request at this location, everything that's inside here is going to be called. In this case, what we're doing is there's this res object, which means response, and so we're going to say res.send hello, and that's what's causing it to say hello. So for example, if I change this to hello ACM, save it, and I'm going to Control-C that and run nodeserver.j again. If I go back here and refresh, it should say hello ACM, which it does. Another thing, just to kind of drive the point home about the location business, because that's going to be important later, if I change this to apples, like /apples instead of just slash, right, I'm going to save that and run nodeserver.js again. And if I go back here, so you'll see that I get that same error message again, cannot get slash. That's because I haven't defined what to do when you go to that location. So here I'm going to say /apples, and it will actually say hello ACM. Okay, cool. So any questions up to this point? Everybody good? So okay, we kind of went through all this. It's just saying like what all we did. So we're going to go ahead and move on to part 3 now. So part 3 is all about kind of the database. So now, like at this point, we've created a very basic, bare bones like backend web server, but it doesn't really do much. Now we want to actually structure it more and create a more structured API that's going to work for our dating app that we're creating. So, kind of moving back from the, taking a step back from the coding and implementation part of it. Let's just think about what our app should be like and what our app should contain. So the way we would define it, right? We're going to say that we have users. So of course, if you have a dating site, you're going to have users. And each user is going to have these fields, right? So each user is going to have a name, a password, an age, a gender, and then what gender they're interested in, since it's a dating site. Another object that we'll have in our app are dates. So basically, I guess the idea kind of is like the users will create dates. So I don't know. You can be creative with it if you want, but yeah, so there's also going to be these date objects. So each date is going to have like a person 1, a person 2, and then it's going to have the date. I guess it's kind of confusing, but this one's the date, like the day of the month or whatever that the date's going to be on, a time and a location. So we're going to have these two different objects. So we want to have these, like each user and each date, we want to exist in a database somewhere so that we can store those long term. So there's lots of different things you can use for databases. MySQL is popular. Oracle Server or something. No, I can't remember that. I think it's just Oracle database. But specifically, we're going to use MongoDB. That's something that's frequently used with Express, which is why we're going to use it. If you're interested, MongoDB is actually a NoSQL database, which means it's non-relational. So it works a little bit differently, but it's still pretty straightforward. You should have gotten that installed from part 0. There is one thing that's not in the notes because it's kind of Windows specific, but if you're on Windows, if you're on Linux or Mac, you probably just have to start the service or just read on the Mongo website how you're gonna actually start Mongo. But I'm gonna show you in Windows you actually are gonna have to start the service in the background. So where's that at? So you go to wherever Mongo is installed at. If you're on Windows, it's probably in your C program files. And MongoDB right here. Go to server 3.6, go into your bin directory. And there's this thing called MongoD. Go ahead and just click that. And it will start running Mongo in the background. Just minimize this. You don't have to worry about it. Just make sure it's running or nothing will work. So, cool. Another thing we're going to want to do, though, most of the database stuff is kind of taken care of for you. So in that models directory, it kind of already defines how our stuff will exist in the database. So you don't really have to worry too much about that. We are going to need to add a little bit of some lines of code and stuff and install this thing called Mongoose. So Mongoose is the node library for interacting with MongoDB. So go ahead and install Mongoose just using that command that I just copied. So npm install -save mongoose. It shouldn't take too long. And cool, yeah, so now we have Mongoose installed. The only reason we even needed to do that was just so that we can actually interact with our database. Yeah.
So whenever I started MongoDB, it just popped up for an instance.
What operating system are you using?
Are you sure you did MongoD instead of just Mongo?
Yeah.
Okay. Well.
We're having various issues installing Mongo around here, it seems.
Yeah, because we were having trouble on this one too.
Yeah.
Oh.
Do me a favor, in the command prompt, Andrew, can you try a Mongo command?
Yeah.
So, you can just type Mongo while that is running.
Well, I think you have to run it from.
Okay.
Does this work?
This one? I don't know.
Oh, that's happening on yours too, Ben.
Is it really?
Yeah. It was working last night. What's going on?
Is it, no, it's still up there down at the bottom. You see the little white? Yeah.
Oh. Okay, I see.
You got it.
Okay.
Let's actually try to close out of this.
Did you call it community edition?
So try rerunning the install. And if it asks you to repair, go ahead and try repair. Yeah. Hey, is anyone else having issues with Mongo in any way?
That was not Mongo.
Are you having issues? What?
I have no idea. Does it? I clicked on it and it didn't.
You look good.
Oh, awesome. Go Max.
Yeah, how can I help you?
No, it didn't work.
You're having the same issue?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Weird. Maybe my computer's just try running Mongo without the D.
Okay. So for those of you on the live stream, if there's anybody, we're having trouble getting Mongo installed on a lot of these computers, so we're trying to or not Mongo installed, trying to run Mongo. So
Did it?
Yeah, it did the same.
We literally just got this working on my computer last night. Yeah, that's my computer.
so can you guys check for this log file?
MongoD.lock, it looks like.
In data/db. I don't know if that. Or just run MongoD -- repair from inside that bin directory. So, well, okay. How do I open up in command prompts from? Can I do that, or do I just need to?
I think you might just need to
Okay.
open up a new command. Yeah.
How do I? Okay.
// Oh,
okay.
there you go. Now go into program files.
What was the command?
Was it MongoD space
-- repair. Yeah. Where am I at?
And we're actually working up here, so I don't really want to mess with that. But
Yeah, I'm just trying to show where the
yeah.
file would be. Yeah, so you'd run like MongoDB -- repair from right here.
So
Okay, I did that. They just trying to run it again.
I guess so, yeah.
don't know why all of a sudden it's giving us issues. It just
But that didn't
Leave it to Microsoft.
That didn't change anything.
So, okay, we can technically get, like, I don't want to waste too much time, so we can technically get through it without Mongo running. You can get through the code part of it. It technically won't work, so that would be kind of a problem, but we can still kind of get through with what we're talking about, so were you able to delete that lock file?
I didn't see it.
I don't know where.
Remove data.
Yeah, I don't know where that would be.
yeah, that might just be something we have to work out afterwards.
Yeah, so we can still get through the code. You'll be able to see stuff working on here, and you can still. I still recommend following through with copying and pasting the code, and once you get MongoDB actually working, everything will just fall together and work. But yeah, so for right now, we're just gonna keep going. We're just gonna keep powering through. If anybody's on the live stream is having trouble as well, we're just gonna keep on powering through. Hopefully, though, you will eventually get it working, and all your code will still work. Just you have to start the MongoDB. So go ahead, and we're gonna modify server.js to look like this. So just take everything here and copy and paste it into server.js, just the whole thing. So all we're doing right here. So remember how we made this? We made Express we basically imported Express. We're doing the same thing for Mongoose. Also in these models here, so that's the one thing I didn't talk about. Like this is kind of taken care of for you. If you're interested in like what these are, you can look through all the code here. It's just defining like what a user even is, defining a bunch of functions for a user, and it's doing the same for date. But we're not going to worry too much about that. We are going to go ahead and get those objects we created though, and it's kind of the same thing as like importing up here, but it's importing a file. So in Node.js, every like JS file is a module, and then you have like these things called module.exports, and those are going to be kind of like, in this case, they're objects that we're going to use to interact with the database. So like if we want to add a user to the database, we'll use this user object. If we want to add a date to the database, we'll use this date object. The rest of stuff you've seen before. This is the only new thing. Other than that, other than those two things, this is the only new thing. Mongoose.connect here. This connects to our actual database. One important note is you don't actually have to create this database with Mongo beforehand. If it doesn't exist, this mongoose.connect command will actually create the database for you. Cool, and everything else is just stuff you see that was there before. Okay, so you guys actually, if you don't have Mongo working, you will get errors, but just to make sure, go ahead and run node surfer.js. So if you have gotten Mongo working, it should be doing the same thing it was before, and you shouldn't get any errors. If Mongo is not working, you will probably get some kind of connection error.
Yeah, you'll get something, I believe, to the effect of, like, uncaught, promise, deprecated, something like that. Yeah.
Something, yeah. Okay, so we kind of got off topic there a little bit, kind of distracted. But all we really did here was get Mongoose and get our database set up so that we can actually have these users and these dates in here, so that we can access them, right? And you kind of think about this maybe to put it in perspective of what it is we're actually doing. If I'm creating Facebook or something, right? Every user on Facebook is like an entry in a database, and they have like their different attributes would be like their all their friends and like their all other stuff you put on Facebook. So that's all the database stuff. We're gonna go ahead and move on to really the real bread and butter of what this Codelab is about, and that's routing. This is the actual API stuff that we're gonna be doing. So now we have all the database set up. We're gonna want to go ahead and start creating the different routes. So what that means is that, okay, like if the client, like your web browser, goes to localhost 3000/apples, what should they get? If they go to /API/users, what should they get? If they go to /API, what should they get? Right? And that's all that's really saying. So real quick before we get going with that, I want to do like a really quick summary of HTTP requests. So again, like you might have heard of these before. If you've taken CS2, you definitely have. But basically, in how like HTTP works, which is basically just how the web works, you have a client, which is like your web browser, and it's just sent a request to the server, and the server is where all the HTML files and all the stuff we're doing right now exists. So that server is going to process that request, and that request normally is just like some text that's coming through. It's going to process the request, and then based on what the request is, it's going to send a response back to the client. So there's a bunch of different types of requests. There's like, get and post, delete, which are these here, and there's a whole bunch more. For our purposes here, we're going to mainly focus on these three, get, post, and delete. The names are pretty self-explanatory. Get is the request that you'd use. So like if the client wants to get something from the server, like say they want, an HTML file, or they want a list of the users in a database, or they just want a message that says hello, then they're going to send a GET request to the server. And so that's what a GET request is for. Post request is usually used if you want to add something to the database. So let's say I want to create a new user or a new date, then I'm going to send a post request to our API, and that's going to post a new user or a new date to our database and create a new one. And delete, you can kind of, I don't know why I put like post here, but you can kind of think of it as, if we're adding something, we should be able to delete it too. So if we're sending a delete request to our API, it means we probably want to delete some kind of entry in the database. So we want to delete the user, or we want to delete a date or something. So we're going to actually use requests like the get, post, and delete request, as well as the concept of routes, which we haven't really talked about yet. We're going to use that to define how our API is going to work. So for example, just to kind of help you get an idea of what this really means, like let's just define that if a if our server receives a GET request to the route/API/users, so that means HTTP is sending a GET request to the address, localhost 3000/API/users, right? Which is where I'm at. So like right here, that's how we're defining if you get a GET request at that location, then we're going to tell the server to respond with a list of all the users in the database. And that's just kind of how we're defining what it means to receive a GET request at this location. So let's actually implement that, right? Any questions at this point, by the way? Okay. So we're going to add this. So there's that app.get thing we wrote earlier. We're going to put it after that. And it's really kind of the same thing. All right, so now you have a kind of better understanding of what a GET request is. And so with this one, we were saying app.get. That means respond to a GET request at this location and do whatever's inside this function. It's the same exact thing here. We're saying respond to a GET request at this location, API/users, and then when you receive that GET request, do everything that's inside this function. That's really the big idea that I want to try to drive home, is that it's just going to do everything that's inside that function. So JavaScript is very event driven, so you can throw functions inside functions and stuff. But the point is it's very event driven. So this is kind of an event when it gets the GET request, and it's just going to call whatever's inside this function. So what is inside this function then? Well, we're using that user object we created earlier to get all the users in the database. That's just a function that's defined in user.js, user.getUsers. It also has a callback function that as arguments are error and the list of all the users. So if there's an error, we're just going to throw the error, right? Else, if we're going to go ahead and send that list of users. So if there's not an error, then this users thing is going to exist. It's going to be like a JSON array of all the users that are in our database. And we'll say res.json users. And that's going to send, this is just kind of shorthand for saying, or it's not really shorthand, it's a function. If you want to send JSON as a response, then you say res.json, and then you put in some kind of JavaScript object into there. So that's all that's doing. So let's now see it working. So if we run node server.js again. Oh, I didn't save. Okay. So I'm going to run node server.js again. Now, if we go to our browser, back to our browser, and go to, so remember it was API/users, you'll see an empty array. So this is good because that means it's working. Like we expected an array to come back, and we're getting an empty array, but that's just because there are no users in our database. We haven't created any users. So let's define how to do that now. So let's go back. What am I doing? Let's go back here and yeah. So let's now define a route to actually add users to the database. Before we do that, right, we need to talk about we need to add this body parser thing. So okay, let me back up a minute. So if we want to add a user to the database, how we're going to define that being done is we're going to say that the client sends a post request, right? We talked about that. A post is saying I'm going to add something to the database. So the client's going to send a post request to this route that we're going to say it's API/user. So if we get a post request to API/user, we need to create a new user. But that user has certain attributes, and we want the client to actually send those attributes over. So ideally, it'd be like an HTML form or something with all those attributes on it, and it would actually create a JSON object that it would then send to the API. Right? So then that JSON object that's going to be for that user is going to be part of the body of the request. And in Express, for some reason you can't actually directly just access the body of the request without using this middleware called body parser. So we installed that earlier in one of the first parts. So we're going to actually go ahead and import it now. So just up here where we're importing all our dependencies, I'm going to go ahead and just say just get body parser there. And that's all it's doing. It's just using body parser. And now what we want to do, after this let app equals express, we're actually going to say app.use body parser.json. I think that's right. Yeah. And so you'll frequently hear people call this middleware. All it really means is that we're telling our server, okay, also use this thing, and this is going to allow us later to actually be able to access the body of requests. So without this, we wouldn't be able to get what's being sent in the body. And this may make more sense when you actually see what the body of the request looks like. Okay, so that was just kind of something you have to do before we can do this. Let's now, that post route we kind of defined earlier, where if we send a post request to the API/user route, it creates a new user. Let's go ahead and define that now. So just for now, just copy and paste this code, and go ahead and put it. Just put it, somewhere. You should be having like where all your requests are, like all your routes here. So go ahead and just copy and paste it right there. And we'll talk about it in a minute. But let's go ahead and test it first, right? Okay, so far we've been able to use the browser to test our API because we're just using GET requests. And the browser is really good at doing GET requests because that's what the browser does all day long. But in order to send a post request, you can probably do it with like Chrome Developer Tools or something. But I prefer a tool called Postman, which I had you install. Did I hit right click? Okay. Oh, I think I opened it. That makes sense. My bad. Alright, so I have this kind of detailed in the notes. So when you first open up Postman, it's going to ask you to like create an account or something. You don't actually have to do that. You can just say, like, there's something at the bottom that says just like proceed without creating an account. And if you want to create an account, you can, I guess. But eventually you want to get to this screen here. By the way, are there any questions up to this point? Ready? Okay, cool. So go to this screen here. So in order to make a post request, well, we need to change this from get to post, right? So this is saying like send a get request, and this is saying send a post request. So just to kind of, just for fun, right? We've been doing get requests all this whole time, right? So we can say maybe API/users. Let me make sure server.js is running. Yeah, it is. So this is essentially just like a kind of it's kind of like a web browser because it just allows you to send GET requests and POST requests and stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and send that, and you'll see I get that empty JSON array back. So it's the same thing that your browser is doing. This is just a useful tool to do requests with. So let's actually change that to POST since we want to do a POST request. And the route we defined earlier was API/user. So this URL up here should be localhost:3000 /API/user. Okay, we're going to go ahead and go over, this is all detailed in the notes, but HTTP requests have something called headers, which tells you different information about the request. One of those, it contains like key value pairs that will tell you information about it. So one of those key value pairs is content type, or one of those keys is content type, so that tells you what is the type of content that you're going to be sending to the client, back to the client. Or no, that you're sending to the server, sorry. And what we're going to put in here, we're going to be sending JSON. So type in application/JSON. Cool. So everybody got that on the headers? Just put in content type and then application/JSON. And then what you're going to do is go over here to this body tab. And there's these radio buttons here. You're going to actually want to put raw. And what that's going to do is going to allow you to type in the raw data that you're going to send. Since you put in the headers that it's going to be JSON, then you don't really need to worry about this. It should do this by default. But if for some reason this is on like text or something, go over here and change it to JSON. And that way it'll have like all the syntax stuff. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just copy and paste what you need to send. So this is the definition for our new user. So I don't know how well you can see this, but we're saying like, okay, we know that each user has a username, password, age, gender, and interested in. We defined that earlier. So we're going to send that to our database, right? So the username for this one is Jane Doe. Password is password that I sure hope isn't stored in plain text. Age 21, gender female, illustrated male. Right. That's this. We're gonna send this JSON object as part of the body, as part of our request. Right. And that's just so that's defining a new user. And again, ideally, if you made a front end for this app, you would have like an HTML form that would ask you for all these things. It would just generate this object and then send that request. So I'm going to go ahead and hit send. Well, I should probably save and rerun node server.js. So I'm going to Control-C that and run that again. Cool. And then go back to Postman and hit send. And if it's a success, it should just send you the object that you just sent back. And we'll look at that code more in a second. But just to make sure it worked, let's actually go back to our browser and go here. So before there were no users in the database, so it just returned an empty array. But now there should be a user in the database. So when we refresh this, it should give us that, right? And if you're on Firefox, it would look a lot better and actually show you the JSON printed out. But we're not on Firefox, so but yeah. Cool. So the point is, right? It added that to the database. So now it now exists in our database. There is a really important note here, and we will talk about the code in a second. But I really want to point this out, that we're actually storing the plain text passwords here, just because I don't want to go into the details of like hashing the password and everything. That is a terrible idea. Don't ever do that if you're actually creating an app. Also, don't make it a public route to be able to access a list of all the users in the database. That's generally not a good idea. But I just kind of wanted to put it there just to show you how it works. In reality, if you're actually making the app, you would actually hash the password before you put them in the database. So that's an important note. So let's look at the code now, what we added. So it's really, really similar to the other ones, right? So the other one we said app.get, and that said listen for a GET request. Well, this one we're going to say app.post, listen for a POST request. So listen for a POST request at this location, and then when you get that POST request, just run everything that's inside this function. Okay, so then I'm asking what's inside the function. Well, it's really honestly pretty simple. So we're getting the new user from request.body. Now, if we hadn't used a body parser, this actually would not work because request.body wouldn't actually exist. But we're going to be able to get that from the body, store it in a variable called new user, because we're using body parser, and because that body should have something in it. It should have that user in it. Now what we're going to do is use that user object that we created to actually, and it has a function called add user that says like add a new user to the database. And that takes as arguments, and you can look in user.js to see these arguments. But the arguments are the user that you want to add, and then a callback function. So that callback function, if there's an error, let's just throw it. Otherwise, just to say that it's a success, let's send the actual user back, the new user that you created back. And that's kind of just a message to tell the client, like, okay, it was a success. And you should probably do something in here, like tell the client it was not a success, but it's fine. So, any questions about that? I'm good. Cool. Okay, so we've added the capability to access all the users. We can add a new user, so now we should be able to delete a user as well. And that's what this thing is going to do. So again, for now, let's just copy and paste that into our server.js file. And let's talk about it for a minute. So again, really, really similar, kind of straightforward way that this kind of routing works. So earlier we're listening for a GET request, and we're listening for a POST request. This time we're listening for a delete request. So we're going to say app.delete. That's saying listen for a delete request, and then at this location. Okay, there is something kind of special here. So you'll notice this API/user, and then it has this like :_ID. So the colon means that everything after this is going to be a parameter, so it can change based on, like, you can go localhost :3000/API/user, and then after that you put something and it's going to change, and that's going to be something that you can access using this request.params. Whatever the name of that was. And that's what we're doing here, because the idea is, right, so if we go back here to Postman, you'll notice that this entry in the database, this user has an ID right there. So what we want to be able to do is when we send a delete request, send that ID over so that we know which entry in the database to actually delete. And that's why we're having it set up like that. So yeah, it's saying listen for a delete request at this location with this parameter, and then run whatever's inside this function. And what's inside this function, it looks a little more complicated, but that's just because they're more like error checking in here. It's not really that more complicated than the other ones. Basically, we're going to find a user in the database. And this is our kind of query where we're saying, okay, the ID of the user in the database is going to be equal to this ID that we passed in through the request. That's going to have this callback function. If there's an error, let's just throw it. It also sends this user object back, which actually it doesn't do, so I should probably not call that user. If that doesn't exist, then we'll send a message saying that it was not a success and that the ID was bad. If it does exist, then we're actually going to call this user.deleteUser thing. So yeah, and then user.deleteUser is again a function defined in here. We pass in the ID of the user, which of course is passed in through the request, and then that's going to have a callback function. So JavaScript is always just functions inside functions, right? That's going to have a callback function. Again, if there's an error, let's just send a message saying that it was not a success. But if there was no error, then finally we can actually go ahead and send that user, or just send kind of confirmation back. That shouldn't really be that way. You'll see why in a second. But okay, so I'm going to save that. And now what we're going to do, well, let's go ahead and copy and paste this ID. So we're wanting to delete Jane Doe now. So let's copy and paste that ID. And then what we'll do is change post up here in Postman to get. And we define it as API/user/ID. So the idea is after this, you would paste in that ID that you had just created, or you just copied. And now what will happen is I'm going to hit send, and I should get something back. Oh, I need to run that.
Yeah, you're also trying to do a GET request.
Oh, did I?
That's your other issue.
Okay, so we need to delete requests, and I also need to run node. Cool. So now I should be able to send, and cool. So yeah, like I said, it doesn't actually send the user back. That was kind of, you should probably change that in the code, but it just sends an error back saying like it's okay, like it deleted a user, it worked. So now, if we go back here to localhost 3000 API users, we had that user in the database. Now, if we refresh, the user is not in the database anymore. And that's the whole thing, right? So there's, of course, more functionality you could add for users. Like you might want to just be able to access just specifically one user. You might want to be able to access, like, you might want to have some kind of profile object that has all the information about the user in kind of a more concise format. There's all kinds of things, and you should get creative and figure out what to do with that. But yeah, so let's go ahead and finish up our routing thing here. So just to kind of review what we did, we can add a user, we can look at all the users in the database, and we can delete a user, which is pretty great because that's a lot of stuff we would need to be able to do if we're actually creating a dating site. We also need to add that same exact functionality for all of our date objects. Now, if I just did all that again, it would be really redundant because it's all the same exact thing, just with date. So I just added it to this code, and you can see here, this is the state of server.js right now. So I'm just going to be lazy and copy and paste this entire thing. And you can see it's, I don't know how to, cool. You can see it's just everything we had before, but it's adding all the stuff to the date. So this just, instead of user, just says date, and that's how all these work. So it's literally the same thing over and over again, just with date instead of user. And there's all the stuff we had earlier. But now, I mean, you've pretty much seen it working at this point, right? Just to verify that it still works, we'll run node server.js. And didn't get any error messages. We should be able to go here. We can go to dates. And of course, there's no date exists. We have defined how to add a date. So if we wanted to add a date, we could go into Postman and do a post request to API/dates. And we could say, what am I doing? Body? Oh, I think I need to go up here. Yeah, cool. So still says content type application/JSON. Here I'm going to change this. I forgot how we have dates defined, but let's look at it. So, well, okay. We're actually kind of running out of time, and there's another thing I want to talk about. But you kind of get the idea. It's the same idea as how we added a user, but you're just going to do the same thing with the date. So you're going to define all the properties of this date, send that post request to the API. It's going to create an entry in the database, and that's going to just exist in the database. So that's basically it. You know, that's how you create an API. That's basically how you can create an API. Hopefully, I know that Mongo thing was kind of an issue, so I wish that wouldn't have happened. You would have been able to see it better and actually interact with it. But hopefully you get Mongo working and you can get this working, and then you can get more creative with it and add all kinds of other things. So what should you do now? Well, so at this point you have created a functional API. So what you should do now is come to our March 7th meeting over front-end web development with React Redux. So Ben's going to be putting that on. And what we're actually going to do is between now and then, we're going to polish this API, make it better, and then Ben's going to make a front end for it during that meeting. So we're going to actually have like a fully functional dating app, hopefully, by that meeting. So you should definitely come to that if you're interested in front end development. Some other things you can do. Add the password hashing capability. So I talked about that for a minute. It's really insecure as it is right now because you're just storing the plain text passwords. If you're making a website, don't do that. If you're using a website that does do that, do not ever do that. Best use that website again. So I provided a link to a library that you can use called bcrypt. Once you read the documentation, it's pretty straightforward how to implement it. You also might want to use like this thing called JSON Web Token, which is going to restrict the users from accessing certain parts of the API unless they have a token. So this is kind of like logging in. I guess when you log into something, this is kind of a way to do it. There's also other authentication methods. And the idea is, right, when they want to authenticate, they would send their password through. You would hash that password, and then bcrypt has methods for seeing if this password that was sent is the same as the hash password that's stored in the database. And if they're the same, you basically would authorize this token. So you'd be authorizing that user to access certain parts of the API, certain routes. And again, I didn't put it on here, but I really recommend maybe adding more types of objects to the database to make it more interesting. And yeah, that's pretty much it. If you're interested in this kind of API stuff and you want to actually help, because by the time we want to have a pretty good polished API by the time we make the React Redux meeting. So I'm going to actually put all the code for this API in a repo, and if you want to help add stuff to the API, feel free to just shoot me a message or just make a pull request or something when I put that up. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So,
one last thing, and then we got to get out of here so I can take the room. We have Hacklahoma coming up. That's the hackathon at OU from March 3rd through 4th. The deadline to sign up is tomorrow night. So